everyone hear me? Everyone hear me? Some portion of people? Oh, wow. Hi. Hi. Welcome. Welcome. Hi, Steve. Excuse me. Are you guys ready to rock out about choice architecture?
Yeah!
Wow, it's a very exciting topic. Welcome. The name of this talk is really dumb, and I apologize. It's Do Say the Right Thing. Choice architecture, player expression, and narrative design in Fallout New Vegas. I'm going to be talking a lot about Fallout New Vegas, but also a lot of other things. My name is Josh Sawyer. I'm a project director with Obsidian Entertainment. Before we start, there are a few things that GDC would like me to go over for you all. One, please turn off your cell phones or set them to vibrate or telepathic link or whatever sort of cool features are coming out these days. Basically, just turn the ringer off. Also, you should be receiving an evaluation form via email. Please fill it out because it helps GDC evaluate things and do cool, awesome stuff. Awesome. Let us start. So just a little bit of background. I'm a project director at Obsidian Entertainment and a lead designer. My background is in design. I started design at Black Isle Studios back in the late 90s on the Icewind Dale series. I am primarily a system designer and adapter of systems. I've worked on a lot of Dungeons & Dragons games, so I've had to do a lot of work adapting rule systems. Even though I do writing, my job is not primarily doing writing. I work a lot on the mechanics surrounding writing, which is why I wanted to give this talk. I'll get a little bit into the sort of difference between the prose and the choice architecture, but I focus primarily on system mechanics. My role on Fallout New Vegas was as the lead designer, system designer, and project director, just to sort of let it be known. There were actually a number of people that contributed to the dialogue on Fallout New Vegas. John Gonzalez was actually our creative director, and he wrote the story. We had a lot of great writers on the project that all contributed to making it a very open narrative experience. I am a tabletop RPG player. I have been a tabletop RPG player for a very, very long time. I love playing computer role-playing games, but I consider myself to be a fairly broad spectrum gamer now. I used to be very focused on PC RPGs, but now I play lots of console games, action games, racing games, all sorts of stuff. So that's my background. All right, hold on. I've already screwed up this presentation. This is awesome. Yes. Okay. So this talk is really about branching dialogue and the sort of challenges that come up with branching dialogue. Branching dialogue is not necessary. It kind of goes without saying, but I thought it needed to be addressed. It's not necessary or even desirable for lots of games. There are a lot of different styles of dialogue that you can approach in a game. These are the three sort of broad categories that I identified when I was preparing this talk. The first is linear or cinematic. This is arguably the most common that you'll see in games, especially nowadays. Sort of exemplified by games like the Uncharted series. The story is written, the characters are established, the player doesn't really have agency in how those characters interact with each other or how the story unfolds. It's a cinematic experience, writing's great, looks awesome, and the focus is really on the gameplay, and you're just the cinematic storytelling and the dialogue is there to serve a narrative function. It's not about player agency. Totally valid, cool thing to do. Another way of approaching dialogue is what I call keyword or subject dialogue. This is also not really about player agency. This isn't about saying to the player, you get to shape the story. It's about saying to the player, hey, do you want to learn more about this setting? Do you want to learn more about this world? Do you want to trigger this quest now? And so a game like the Diablo series uses this, where you have a list of things to talk about, and the player is really just saying, like, tell me about this thing, tell me about this thing, tell me about this thing. So again, it's not about granting player agency. It's really about allowing the player to make a choice as to when they want to receive any bit of narrative content. What this talk is about, though, is about branching trees. This is dialogue where you have menus of options presented in a variety of ways, where the dialogue can flow, branch out even more, circle back on itself. Ideally, it's producing gameplay changes, it's producing story changes. It's not a whole lot of companies necessarily do this. I'm glad so many of you came. I wasn't sure how broad the appeal would be. But obviously, companies like BioWare excel at it. Black Isle, we did it back at Black Isle. We continue to do it at Obsidian. Bethesda also does it. I'm sure there are other companies that do it as well. But it's a tricky thing, and that's why I'm having this talk. So someone might ask, why even use branching trees? What's the advantage? You can get all sorts of cool cinematic stuff and cool character development with good voice acting and everything in a purely cinematic view. Why even use branching trees? There are a few very good reasons for this. First is you get to grant story agency to the player. You get to say to the player, hey, you know what? You have some role in defining where the story goes and how it unfolds. It's very important for a lot of people, especially in role-playing games. For a lot of people who came from a tabletop or pen and paper background, they really, really enjoy the ability to screw with the story in some ways and make it their own. You also grant character agency, and I want to differentiate that from story agency. You're not just changing the story, but you have the ability to express what type of person your character is. So if you're a jackass, or you're a really cool guy, or you want to smooch some girl or something, whatever, that's why we build that in there, to allow you to express the type of character you are, not just how the story goes, but how you make it unfold. Also, it forces you to make tactical and strategic choices. Again, this is sort of ideally, this is what I'm going towards in the talk, but good dialogue is gameplay, and the player should look at it as a series of choices that they're making, short-term choices and long-term choices. And when it's done very well, the player feels very engaged, they're paying attention, they pause to think about what they want to do, they feel satisfaction and the sting of making sacrifices along the way, and that produces great gameplay through dialogue. And also, it produces reactive narrative content. This can take place outside of the dialogue itself. This can be people giving what we call bark strings in the world. Someone saying like, hey man, thanks for, blowing up our town, you asshole, or whatever. It's all that sort of rich world reactivity that doesn't really need to be deep. It just needs to be actually more widespread and shallow, but it makes the player feel that the world pays attention to the things that he or she does. So this talk is not about writing prose. There are writers' roundtables. Actually, one's going on right now, strangely enough. There are great writers' roundtables that are going on. Obviously, Austin GDC has a bunch of cool writer stuff going on. This isn't really about prose and writing good dialogue from the perspective of aesthetics. It's about choices. The reason why I want to start with choice architecture is because it should come under and before prose. Choices inform the prose that you write, but choices present problems on their own, a lot of problems, and they need to be thought through. And choice is the reason to have branching dialogue in the first place, so it should be the place where we start to think about what we're doing and how we want to do it. So I couldn't quite pinpoint the exact time and place where sort of branching narrative became a thing, but one of the common things that came up was with an author, Jorge Luis Borges, and he wrote a book called The Garden of Forking Paths. And this was pretty radical at the time because this story could be read in a lot of different ways, and the reader would arrive at different conclusions about what the narrative was and where it went. Someone writing a few years ago about this had this cool quote that actually, when I can see it on my screen, I'll read out to you. Borges confronts us with the pullulating moment when we become aware of all the possible choices we might make, all the ways in which we might intersect one another for good or evil. His imagined Garden of Forking Paths is both a book and a landscape, a book that has the shape of a labyrinth that folds back upon itself in infinite regression. This is the definition of sort of the possibility space for the player. When we empower the player to make choices and then reward them for making choices, they become aware of the power they have in the story, and they start to embrace it. If we consistently reward that, they feel like they have a very strong role as a player in determining the outcome, and they engage with the story much more than if they're just watching it, because they realize they're an active participant in it. Jeez Louise. This is when I actually started caring about it. Strangely enough, I was not reading Borges when I was 5 years old. I was reading The Cave of Time, which is my favorite of the Choose Your Own Adventure series. I'm curious, how many people have read Choose Your Own Adventure books? Yeah. Those are a great series of books. Awesome. Yes. Yes. So Choose Your Own Adventure books they're great. Fantastic stuff. Every book is a different sort of style of book or genre of book, but they all have that idea of branching narrative. However, if you were even a remotely smart kid, what you started to do after you read a few of these books was you start to put your finger in the page before you made a choice. And just to draw a parallel, this is not really that different from abusing a save load mechanic. which is actually a big point of some of the things I come to later. So Choose Your Own Adventure books are the start of this, but even they had underlying problems that still persist now in branching dialogue and role-playing games. Then later on, I really got into role-playing games, tabletop role-playing games. And I played with a lot of different DMs, and I was the DM and a lot of different players. And the stuff that I enjoyed the most, and the stuff my players seemed to enjoy the most, is when the story was constructed in such a way that the players could fuck it up. Basically, they could screw with it, and they could push it, and they could pull it, and they could smack the quest giver and like throw him down a well, and the story could keep working, and then it rolled with it, and that was so satisfying to them. And often there were consequences for doing that sort of stuff, but they felt very empowered in that environment, especially because that was just, it's up to the people there and their imagination. So that feeling can be hard to emulate in a computer environment, but that's what ideally we try to do. And so this had a lasting effect on me. I played tons of these games, and the most satisfying times were the ones where I was able to do that. Dialogue trees in RPGs, my first experience with it was with the original Fallout. Tim Kaine gave a great post-mortem this morning on Fallout. I was in college when Fallout came out, and I was just enthralled with it. I thought it was great. I loved how you could make choices. You could be an evil character. You could be a sort of neutral character. You could do all sorts of different stuff, and the game it wasn't like a grand karmic wheel was there to smash you in the face after you made a bad choice. People reacted to the bad things that you did, but the game itself did not punish you. The designer did not punish you for playing a certain way. Also, when I first came to Black Isle, my first job there was as a webmaster on the web team, and I made the Planescape Torment website, and I was working with the development team, and obviously Torment is very, very widely regarded as a great game with amazing choice and consequence, huge amount of dialogue, lots of reactivity. And so that had an impression on me because when I came into that environment, I saw these guys that were just busting ass to give them, all this choice and consequence to the player. So that was the environment that I came into when I came to Black Isle. So dialogue trees today, I had to get that ass shot in there. Had to. Haven't seen enough of Mass Effect 3. There might be a more up-to-date ass shot that I could have put in there, but I didn't have time. So dialogue trees in CRPGs today, they're not really that different in a lot of ways. They're presented different. The aesthetics are a lot different. But kind of fundamentally under the hood how they work, they haven't changed a whole lot. So the changes have been primarily aesthetic, not really structural. But there are persistent flaws. And to me, in my mind, that sort of suggests a lack of analysis to this point in time. I've been thinking about this a lot over the past few games I've been working on. And it's been difficult because I've been writing in this mode and this style for so long. But I've made this talk because I wanted to figure out, what the hell are we still doing wrong? This is the way I want to write dialogues, but there are some underlying flaws here that I need to dig at and get out. We did it also. It's not just other companies that are doing it. And hopefully I will provide more examples of us screwing up in this talk than other companies, although I will give examples of other companies screwing up. On New Vegas, our writers did a great job. John Gonzalez did a great job. All the writers did a great job. Worked very fast using an engine we weren't familiar with. But there were certain structural flaws to it, mechanical things that I saw and other people saw, and they're kind of like, this still kind of feels stinky. There's got to be a better way to handle this. So the core problem for me is about choice conflict. What I mean by choice conflict is when the player's goals and there's the goals of the player as a game-wise conflict with the goals of the character as an expression of the player. So the player has a character who's like a sassy jackass or whatever. The player wants to get a thing. If they play their character as a sassy jackass, they can't get the thing. So when we do that as designers, we're saying your character concept is invalid for this game. That's an extreme example, but that's really the root of the issue, is that doing or saying the right thing, meaning the thing that is actually going to progress the game in the most favorable way, conflicts with the idea of a right character. The two examples I've listed here are Deus Ex's social boss battles, which, no offense, I actually thought Deus Ex Human Revolution was a fantastic game. I liked how they presented their conversations, but the conversations felt like puzzles. They didn't feel like things that grant player agency, because if you choose to play a character in a certain way in that conversation, you will lose the conversation. However, similarly, in Fallout New Vegas, we have dialogue skills like speech and barter. We also have dialogue perks, and they become you win the conversation choices. In the choice here, talking with, I can't remember that guy's name, Santiago, I think. When you're talking with Santiago, if you pick anything other than the speech option, you're basically intentionally handicapping yourself. So if you want to role play a certain way, we're essentially saying, okay, thanks for being a dummy. You are going to lose out in this situation. So to repeat this, this is the main subject of this talk that I screwed up yet again, is that doing or saying the right thing to get a gameplay advantage, the gameplay advantage to move it forward the way you want to, conflicts with being the right character. And you may be saying, well, sassy man, what's the right character? That's your voice in my head, by the way. The answer is any character that falls within our supported range of expression for the player, that's a right character. If we allow you to play out a certain fantasy, that's a right character. Some of this has to do with consistency. If we consistently reinforce something for the player and then pull the rug out from under him or her, bad news. So when we look at what's a valid character, we define that expression range and we have to support it. If we don't, we're letting the player down. We're saying, yeah, we kind of allow you to play this, but not really. It's mostly cosmetic, and sometimes you'll get something out of it, but most of the time you're going to get screwed. That's the problem. It's a game. It's not a puzzle. Puzzles are not really games. There are right answers and wrong answers. It is not a movie. It is not something you sort of sit back and watch. And it is not a book. It is not just for reading. You're making choices to go through it. It's a game. And if we embrace dialogue as gameplay and not things that are sort of ancillary to the game and treat it as like, well, yeah, there's the game and then there's the story. If you're doing branching dialogue, I think it's important that, and again, you don't have to do branching dialogue. It's not important for all games. But if you're going to do that, then you should do it as well as you can, and you should incorporate it into the gameplay. So my assertion here is that if you plan well, you can avoid choice conflict. When all the ways that you can go through the game are considered validated ways, and you give a clear response and reactivity spectrum to the player, meaning you make a choice, you get this feedback, you make this choice, you get this feedback. When that happens, the player benefits and the character roles align. There is not a conflict, because you've already planned out, hey, if a player wants to be a crazy jackass, they're going to make these sacrifices, but they're going to get this out of it, and they're going to feel good about it. But it takes planning. You can't just like decide to do it. It doesn't happen spontaneously. You have to look at three things when you're planning this stuff out. The types of choices you want to allow the player to make, the range of player and character expression. This is sort of like, well, what sort of characters are actually valid within this game? As an example, in Fallout 1, you could kill kids. Wowee. In Fallout 2, you could marry somebody and then basically sell them as into like porndom. So that's like a range of expression that says like, okay, the goalposts are really far apart here. So once you've sort of established that, that's what you're going for. And then finally, your narrative goals. You as designers, you also have to accomplish certain things. You have to communicate certain things to the players, and those can be in conflict with what the player wants to do. If you say, hey, player, you can be a sassy jackass, but if you do that, you're going to miss all this critical information for playing the game, that's kind of sucks. So here's my systemic approach to doing this. Consider the types of choices that you're going to make. Define the range of player and character expression. Establish the narrative goals that you have for the game that you need to communicate. Then get some perspective on how these three things work together. Then you write your prose. And again, this is not about prose. That's a separate sort of subject that can be a rich tapestry of interesting things. Not here, though. And then everyone goes, my God, your game is so amazing. Thank you. I got to play exactly the character I wanted. You're the best. So step one is considering the types of choices you can make. So you want to provide tactical choices to the player. Tactical choices are what I would call node-by-node choices. In the conversation, every node where you're allowed to make a choice, there should be some sort of tactical decision there. Those are immediate reactions. Strategic choices. This is long-term planning. This is not necessarily about, I'm going to say this and this guy's going to get mad at me and then this girl's going to give me a kiss. It's about you're sort of like building reputations with people, indirect reputation mechanics, things like that. You want to forecast consequences. There's actually a pretty cool anecdote that Tim Kaine brought up in the Q&A session of Fallout 1, which is about the ending of Junktown in Fallout 1. So Junktown, initially, the endings were, if you put Killian Darkwater, who's like the good guy, in power, then Junktown gets screwed. And if you put Gizmo, who's the scumbag, in charge, Junktown actually does very well. But the consequences of that weren't really forecast. It was kind of just, it was a reversal. It just said like, haha, actually Killian sucks. And because those consequences weren't forecast, it felt weird to a lot of people, even though it was arguably more interesting. And then finally, you have to validate all options to avoid the perception of win or loss, the perception of, well, I guess I just made the wrong choice. I'm playing the wrong sort of character. I should go back and try to get something else out of it. So some words on choice architecture. Hopefully I won't screw this up yet another time as I go to look at it. So I've been reading an interesting book by two professors from University of Chicago called Nudge, and it's about choice architecture and a lot of other things. And there's this interesting quote that one of the authors gave at a convention about choice architecture. So choice architects must choose something. You have to meddle. For example, you can't design a neutral building. There is no such thing. A building must have doors, elevators, restrooms. All of these details influence choices people make. There is nothing neutral about putting an attack reply at the top of a dialogue tree structure. There is nothing neutral about putting a goodbye reply at the end of the dialogue tree structure. These are consistent choices that you make. How you lay these things out, how you present them to the player, that has a huge impact on how they perceive them and how they make choices. In Obsidian games, Forever, and Black Isle games, usually the default option for everything is always the top one, because we find that people tend to just gravitate there. If you put an attack node there, ooh, people get mad because they start going 1, 1, 1. God damn it, why am I in combat? So it matters. That goes back to this idea. You really do have to think about how you lay these things out. Oh my God, yet again, what am I doing? How do I use PowerPoint? So node-by-node choices, just to go back to this, node-by-node choices are, again, you get to a point in dialogue, the guy says, yeah, what are you going to do about it, buddy? And then you have three options. You can say, well, I'm sorry, let's work it out. I'm a diplomatic guy. Or, I hate your guts, I'm going to stomp you in the face. That's a tactical choice. There's going to be immediate reactivity and feedback to that. So that's a tactical choice. It's short term. These are things, ideally, that happen quite a bit in conversation. They usually require a lot of scripting, so they can't happen all over the place. But these are the things that people really react to, where, what was the conversation in Mass Effect 1 where the reporter is saying something to Shepard, and he's just like, punches her in the face. People are like, oh man, million YouTube videos, I'm the first guy to post this. It's a tactical choice. Very cool. There are also strategic choices to make, though. One thing I identified in here that works generally very well for this are what I just made up this term, indirect reaction systems. These would be things like karma or reputation or loyalty or whatever. You don't get necessarily an immediate feedback out of it, but you're putting pennies in the rainy day event reactivity fund. So, you kind of sass someone, and, NCR gets a little grumpy with you, and that, you get points in the negative pool, and then you do some stuff for Caesar's Legion, and that you get points in the happy pool, and then eventually, some NCR ranger comes up to you and says, you're going to fucking die, bro, and shoots you. So it's a long-term outcome. It's a strategic decision. It's not about having a big scripted reaction. It's about a little reaction that builds up over time. Forecasting consequences. So, I gave that example of the choice from Fallout 1. So the idea is that you want to intrigue the player. You don't need to spell everything out, but you kind of have to forecast what's going to happen. In a writer's roundtable yesterday, one of the guys gave an example of, I don't actually know what game he was talking about, but he said he picked a line that seemed like kind of aggressive, and then he wound up just like gunning a bunch of people down. He was like, whoa, 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 I didn't quite want to be that aggressive. So intrigue the player, but inform them of generally what's going to happen. You can surprise them, but don't make them angry. So if you surprise them in a pleasant way, awesome, great. That's the joy of story as it unfolds. But don't make them mad, because then they just feel like they were sort of tricked into picking something that they didn't want to take. Differentiate the consequences. This is super duper important. False choices, not all players pick up on them, but players are simultaneously smarter and dumber than we think they are. And a lot of them do pick up on fake choices. They sense it very quickly, especially if a game uses them a lot. So I would say, let's just stop doing it. everybody, let's stop doing it. Thank you. Lace consequences with sacrifice. So I'll get into some differences in choice agony, but when a person makes a choice, they should feel like they're making a trade-off. The idea with sacrifice is always that you get something more out of it than you lose, because that's why you made the sacrifice, but you should feel like you did make a trade-off there. And ideally, it's a bunch of different options where there's some pros and cons, and they're not easy choices, but they don't have to be horribly intense. And that push-pull conflict produces agony, and that, generally speaking, is good when it doesn't go too far. Validating the options of choice and consequence. Again, this goes back to when you make a choice, you want to validate it, say, yes, player, this is a correct way to play the game. You're the character you chose to play. We support that. You can keep rolling with this. If you make a similar choice down the road, it's also going to be supported. Keep on trucking. Good job. This is in contrast to choice and no consequence. I'll pick a little bit on Dragon Age here. Dragon Age had a lot of cool stuff in it. This isn't one of them. Sorry. You have a bunch of options that people talk about, and it doesn't produce anything. There's absolutely no different ending result from you picking any of these options. You can circle through it over and over again, and it's the same outcome. It's kind of a waste of the player's time, and it's a waste of the writer's time. So we've done this in the past. Oh, sorry. Oh, geez. We've done this in the past. A lot of companies have done this in the past. I think we do it because we feel that we want to give the player options. But again, players pick up on this stuff. They get irritated with it. If you do it a lot, they get really bored of your dialogue because they feel like the choices they make don't mean anything. Versus win and loss. So again, Fallout New Vegas, we did this all over the place. This is also bad. When you come into this situation, unless you just want to fight, which is, you can still fight even after taking this option, but this option makes it incredibly easy. You can come in here, you have a high speech, and you can just say, hey man, yeah, I'm here to drop off some drugs. See ya. And then you can just walk around and steal everything and then come back and C4 everyone or whatever you want to do. If you have a high speech, you're kind of like shooting yourself in the foot if you don't pick this option. So we're kind of saying, like, if you don't take this, you're playing at a disadvantage. Not really that great or satisfying. So I want to talk about choice extremes. So that's how to spell extremes, by the way, officially. So there are kind of two ends of the spectrum here, neither of which I feel are particularly great. One is the sort of Jesus Hitler option. Again, a lot of our games have had these. Hopefully we've moved mostly away from these because we like moral ambiguity a lot. Jesus Hitler is kind of like, hey, there's a baby. Do you want to give the baby a little smooch on the forehead, or do you want to throw it into an oven? And those, I mean, and we see those options, and they're not really compelling. Like, if you've decided you want to play a crazy dude, then there's no struggle to figure out what you want to do. There's no sacrifice. Just like, well, yeah, I'm a crazy baby killer. There you go. Or no, like, I'm a super nice guy. Why would I ever do that? So there's no real interesting choice to be made there. It's very flat. It is an option, and it is differentiated, hopefully, in how it works out, but it's not that compelling. And then also, the other end of the extreme is Sophie's Choice. Spoilers for a 30-some-year-old book. Yeah, Meryl Streep's character, she has to choose between which of her children will die. No one wants to make that sort of a choice in a game. It's not like, wow, I'm so glad I made that choice instead of that one. It's just two shitty choices. So a player should feel like there's something good and bad out of what they pick, not just like, well, which limb do I lose? Or like, which child do I sacrifice? Those choices, they're interesting in the sense that they produce some struggle, but the player really doesn't feel good about having to make those choices. So ideally, the agony in the conflict is somewhere between these two spectrums. It's not as simple as Jesus Hitler, and it's not heart-wrenching total loss like Sophie's Choice. Just some examples from, actually these are kind of nasty too, but they're differentiated in an important way. So choice agony is, Greek plays do this really, really well and very consistently. Greek plays will, spoilers for 1,000-year-old plays. So in this case, the agony is not between two things that are, to borrow an economics term that I learned yesterday, fungible. They're not between like a child or this arm or this arm. In the case of Orestes and Antigone, it's a choice between two kind of equally bad and equally good options, but the sort of value arithmetic that goes into it is not equal. Orestes' father was killed by his mother, and I think it's Apollo, is saying, yo, you have to avenge your dad, kill your mom. And the Furies are saying, dude, you cannot kill your mom. That is bad news. And he's like, oh, man. And he kills his mom, and then the Furies chase him. And, oh, my God, how agonizing. Antigone wants to honor her brother, bury her brother. I think it's her dad, says, you can't do that. I forbid it. And she's like, wow, this is agonizing. And then she goes over and does it. So, again, the value arithmetic there is not, oh, yeah, well, it's just 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. It's two different things. And when a person reads that, one person might say, well, I value this more than that, I value this more than that, and that's what makes our individual choices more interesting, as opposed to, hey, what color do you dislike more? It's not to be confused with Spice Agony. Just so you know. Choice Agony is not Spice Agony. Arguably, Spice Agony is even cooler because it's from Dune. So, but it's not the same. Sorry, guys. So the second step, I guess I'm doing okay on time, even though I'm screwing around all the time. The second step is to define the range of character and player expression. This is really about, hey, what sort of characters do you want to allow people to play, and are you going to support through the choices that you give? So you want to define a response and reactivity scope. This means what can the player say and how are people going to react to it. It's very important to figure out. What sort of character prototypes? I'm just using that. I made up that term because I didn't want to use archetype. I'll get into that later. What sort of character prototypes do you want to use? Support for character ideas. And then create a range of impacts that you can have. These can be little impacts, big impacts. They can be physical impacts, emotional impacts, all over the place. So figuring out the scope of responses and reactivity is very important. If you are making a game with very split morality, good and evil, that's your range. Is it about shades of gray where there's a lot of moral ambiguity? Are the responses aligned along things like stance? So, for example, Alpha Protocol had stances. There are a number of games that have things like stances where they're more like attitudes. They're not really aligned along morality. And then what sort of reactivity are you going to have? What sort of scripted or direct reactivity are you going to have? And then also what sort of indirect reputation mechanics are you going to have? Reputation, influence, things like that. So the player can get more frequent inputs into that system. As an example, Fallout New Vegas' scope and range. It was really big. One of the cool things about the Fallout setting is that there's just so much crazy stuff in it. And designers have a lot of fun with that. Players usually have a lot of fun with it. It doesn't always result in a consistent experience, though. So there's a huge scope of responses. Anything goes at any scale. So Fallout New Vegas, you couldn't kill children, because I don't think any games allow you to do that anymore. But you can kill everyone else, like everyone. What I told the designers is that you have to imagine that the player has a like Thanatos kill field around them everywhere they go, and they just can't help it. Everyone drops dead. So the whole game was structured so that you could kill everyone. Even your one sort of fall-through guy, you could kill him, and he died, but he would then transfer his consciousness into a different robot and come up to you. So it was very important that we allowed that. Also, you can do all this crazy reverse triple betrayal stuff. Because of our reputation mechanics and the way that they worked, you could start out working for NCR and then kind of drift over to Caesar's Legion and then get on their good side and then, oh, we're actually going to help out Mr. House and then we're going to betray him and go independent. So there's a lot of things and ways that you could weave through the story. There's a lot of scripted reactivity, like a crazy amount of scripted reactivity. And all the credit for that goes to the writing team and the area designers that made that stuff happen. And reputation. We had a reputation system for factions and for locations, and that served as our indirect system where players would either perform actions or do dialogue things and resolve quests to feed into that system. So now I want to talk about prototypes. Again, I use this word instead of archetypes because I think that sometimes archetypes get, that word kind of gets thrown around. Archetype is higher level than these guys. Archetypes are more abstracted than these individual characters. Prototypes, to me, in a role-playing game, are starting points for character concepts. They can be sole characters. Sometimes they're combinations of characters. I want to play Aragorn. I want to play Snake Plissken. I want to play Clint Eastwood's racist character from Gran Torino. By the way, I really want to make an RPG where someone's like, yes, I'm playing Clint Eastwood in Gran Torino. So the idea is that players really, they gravitate towards these characters, and players are creative, but we all start somewhere. And so some players will be like, yeah, I want to be the man with no name. I want to be Lisbeth Salander from, Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. I want to be Blade, whatever. There's a starting point, and then over time, they usually expand from there. But understanding what your game and your genre supports and where that's going to start is very helpful. It's not just useful for defining dialogue, but other things like dress and appearance and costuming and things like that. In fact, in New Vegas, I mean, the number of clothing mods you see for people that are supporting the man, like everyone is, hey, I'm the man with no name. Great, I'm Clint Eastwood in New Vegas. Great. There's like a zillion different clothing packs that support that. So understanding what people are going to want to play is very important. What are the Fallout New Vegas prototypes? Who knows? Because we didn't define them ahead of time, unfortunately. We knew we were going to have a huge range of influences and responses, but we didn't really sit down and think of this ahead of time, unfortunately. So yeah, there's some stuff where you kind of feel like the man with no name, or you also kind of think about you feel like Mad Max. Surprise! These are the same character. One is in Australia, one's in the United States. They're kind of the same dude, though. And like, there's some stuff where you feel kind of like this weird Spec Ops guy. That's that beard guy. You know who I'm talking about. It's that beard guy. And I know he has a real name, but everyone knows him as that beard guy. But we didn't really fully support it. And there's other things that we could have supported, post-apocalyptic characters, like all the crazy tribal people from Doomsday, or even the tribal kids from Beyond Thunderdome and stuff like that. But we didn't really think about it. Also, there are other examples of like strong female characters, like Alice from the Resident Evil series could be considered a post-apocalyptic character. But we didn't really think through like what are we trying to support, unfortunately. So the range of responses was, granted, in the Fallout universe, they're already all over the place, but they didn't really feel like you're playing a consistent character necessarily. You want to create a range of impacts. Choices should have impact. Again, this goes back to don't just kind of make fluff or meaningless choices. You want to ground them and make the player feel like, wow, I'm cool. Like that actually did something. It wasn't just sort of an aesthetic change. You can also make that happen through indirect reaction systems. When the player sees, and some people complain about this, tough shit. When I say like +1 to reputation, I know it's my immersion gets broken, but you see, hey, that actually fed into the system. Great, it's good feedback. So as game designers, even though some people get all worked up about it, it's very good to reward people that way. And then the important thing I think to remember is that narrative or emotional impact is the important scale. There's examples of 2 big impacts from Fallout New Vegas. One is Archimedes 2, this big space laser, and that was in all the trailers. I don't really think that choice had a big emotional impact on a lot of people. The only person that has a strong emotional reaction to it is one of the companions, Arcade, and it's pretty unlikely that you actually have him at that point. It doesn't really influence a lot of things around it. So even though it's like a big event, there's not a lot of emotional strength to it. So it's like, wow, the crazy space laser. I don't care. I'm just going to go on with my adventure. Compare this to, I think, the DLC, especially all the so I did one of the DLCs, Honest Hearts. I'm only putting up there because this is the one that I did. But Chris Avalon was the project director on all the other DLCs other than Gunrunner's Arsenal, and they had great emotional content to them. People really connected with the characters, did a great job there. In Honest Hearts, the sort of resolution of it, people seemed to respond very strongly to because it was a very tense moment between really just 3 people in a very small space. But that sort of stuff can go a long way. So the scale is really about emotional impact. When it comes to change, when the player feels like they're producing something that's really tugs at them, I keep doing this and I shouldn't, it makes them feel good about the choices that they make. Something I think was much better defined in terms of scope and prototype characters was Alpha Protocol. It was very clearly defined. So they had the professional and suave and aggressive stances. There were variants to that would appear in dialogue, but that's pretty much what was established for the spectrum of responses. A lot of heavily scripted reactivity. They also had a reputation mechanic that was used very frequently. And they had 3 prototypes. It took a while to settle on this, but it was called the 3 JBs: Jason Bourne, James Bond, Jack Bauer. Equipment choices, dialogue options, all that sort of stuff kind of fed into that. Is like, if I want to play like Jason Bourne, I'm going to want to say this sort of thing. If I want to play like Jack Bauer, I'm going to smack this guy in the face and like get all aggro on him. And that really helped drive a lot of the choice. People were like, oh, okay, yeah, I get those guys. This is the space that we're working in, which is very important. So step 3 is about establishing narrative goals. Ideally, you should fuse information and emotional content, not do info dumps. You should separate your critical information from optional information. This is very important when you remember, hey, players can go around smacking dudes and skipping over stuff and shortcutting all sorts of things in dialogue. And you want to outline your narrative branching ahead of time. A lot of people look at New Vegas, maybe not everyone, but a lot of people look at it and they go like, wow, how did you plan all that stuff out? And it's actually, I don't want to say it's easy, but when you do it from the beginning, it is not especially hard. If you try to do it 6 months down the road, forget it. Any game that I've worked on where we've planned for this stuff ahead of time, It's gone very, very smoothly. Once you start developing the game and you try to back into a bunch of freedom of play and movement and choice, it doesn't go so well. So don't do this. Dialogue branching is, I think, at its weakest when it comes down to essentially being no more than a keyword list, where you're saying, hey, tell me about this, tell me about this, tell me about this. I think there are much better ways to do it. I think that Mass Effect putting stuff in the codex is a really good way to do it, other than the XP gain, which I think should be gotten rid of. Also, Bioshock does it really well. They have like essentially 3 levels of interaction where there's the main storyline, there's the stuff you can hear through all the tape recorders and things like that. Thank you for reminding me of that. And then also the all the posters and things where you can infer and imply all sorts of other relationships by looking around. So there are other ways to give information about the world and what's going on in it than just info dumping onto the player. If you can give information about the world to the player, try to sort of wrap it inside the emotional content of something else. So a character is talking about something that's important to them, and in the context of talking about that thing, you're learning about the world. If you just have someone sort of stand there and dryly tell you about the world, they're just a narrator for an encyclopedia, and that gets really boring. You have to figure out what your critical and optional information is going to be in the game. Again, very few players want information dumps in dialogue. Most players, they do want to understand what's going on. Usually they're skipping through things because it goes on for too long and tries to tell them much more than they actually need to know. If you write your story well, the player should not need to know a huge amount of information to understand the meat of the plot. And they really shouldn't need to know much about what they're doing in the next stage of their adventure. By the way, hints and hanging references, those are also exposition. A person can reference something without defining it. That's fine. Let it go. Like, let it hang there. Person will be intrigued, look it up later. Maybe another character references that group or organization or religion later. Maybe it's never defined. And the player goes, huh, I wonder what that is. I've gotten so many questions for Fallout New Vegas because Chief Hanlon, Chris Christopherson's character, says, yeah, all the veteran rangers are hunting ghosts down in Baja. And it's like every week I get 2 or 3 people saying, what is he talking about? I am never going to tell you what that is. Never, never, never. Like, something weird's going on down there. They're in Baja. That sounds mysterious. Great. Just let it go. That's a side thing. Cool. That's intriguing. Narrative branching. Obviously, you have to guarantee that all the critical information is communicated. If you allow the player to do something that breaks their understanding of the game, that is very bad. You have to have ways to handle that. You want to isolate reactivity. So reactivity is awesome, and players love reactivity. I think a trap people fall into is they want to make the reactivity really, like there's a huge ripple effect from any, like a pebble hits the water, and like thousands of people are changed forever. And it's very messy. Players don't actually notice it or appreciate it. It causes a lot of bugs. You can actually do a lot of more like very localized reactivity, and players feel like the world is very rich with the reactivity, but it's very light scripting and bug fixing wise. And then generally speaking, more branching is better than bigger branches. So it's more interesting to have like little ways to alter the story and then feed into other things than to try to make one big, massive narrative that branches out in a million different ways. Just recombinant-wise, it becomes very difficult to manage that stuff and to bug fix it. So here's an example from Fallout New Vegas that I think worked pretty darn well. They Went That Away was the first main quest that you go on. So Fallout New Vegas starts with you being shot in the head and dropped in a shallow grave, and your first quest is to go find the people that did it. So your first steps are completely informational and independent of each other. It's really just, where did this dude go? It's Benny, the guy in the crazy checkered suit. Where did he go? And you go from step to step, and each person tells you something more that you follow and follow and follow. Because they're just information and they're independent of each other, the player can actually go straight to New Vegas from Good Springs without ever going into any of the other steps. They can do things in different orders. They can go straight to Novac through a pass. They can go to Boulder City. They can do things in all sorts of different order because the story still makes sense. The story is, find out who shot me and where that person is. If you just walk into Vegas, the story still makes sense. You miss little side details. Actually, you miss quite a few side details along the way, but the story is flexible. And by the way, we just totally ripped off Fallout 1 for this. Just ripped it right off. If you look at Fallout 1, the first critical step, you leave the vault, find the water chip. That is actually the first critical path thing that you need to do is find the water chip. You can walk from Vault 13 to the Necropolis. You do not have to do anything else in between. that's the way the story makes sense because you're pointed, hey, go check out Vault 15. Oh, it's not there. Oh, I'll go back to this town. Oh, what's that, raiders? Oh, okay, I'll go to the raider den. Oh, I'll go to the here. So it unfolds in a very logical fashion, but the player is not required to do things that way because it's all about information. The reactivity is very localized to those places. So reactivity is in that space, and then later on, maybe we'll have, we do this all over New Vegas. You do a quest, hours later, some random dude out in the middle of nowhere goes, hey, reaction to the quest that you did. And they're like, oh my God, this world is full of all this reactivity. But it's really just that one character doing that one thing, and then it's completely forgotten about. But if you do that for a ton of quests, then people go like, wow, there is really a lot of stuff going on where people remember and do things, and this world is alive. Critical information is always the next step. That's very important. Supplemental info is seasoned all over the place, and the player freedom is huge. You can kill everyone. You can go to the first town. Where are these guys? Bam, bam, bam. The guy's like, I don't want to tell you. Bam, shoot him, take a thing off his body. Go to the next town. Hey, who are all you guys? Cool. Go to the next town, and the story, it makes sense because all the information is there. You go to the next town, the guy in the dinosaur Manny says, well, I know where those guys are, but I need help. And you're like, yeah, you need help. You need a doctor. Boom. And you take it. And I mean, you can kill everyone. You don't have to, like, you can just keep going, and the story totally makes sense, and you're just this whirlwind of death. And it worked very well. So the fourth step is to get some perspective on this stuff. So this is your analysis, where you've sort of looked at all these things. And when you start to look at the choices you're giving, are they satisfactory? So outside of what you've defined, when you say, like, if a player were playing this, are they going to like the choices that they're given? And are they going to like how they play out? Look at the role-playing versus the benefit. If I'm playing a certain type of character, do I get enough of a benefit that I don't feel like I'm being penalized for playing that sort of character? And if there's a conflict, you have to identify what that conflict is. Look at your critical and optional narrative. Is the player getting everything that he or she needs to actually understand what the story is? Again, this is separate from the optional stuff. But the optional stuff they can skip, that's fine. Players that want to dig, they're going to dig. You don't need to, like, force it in their face. You don't need to bribe them to look at it. That's fine. Then write your prose. No problem, man. Super easy. Well, the point is that once you've identified the sort of range of this stuff, it's not that necessarily writing prose is easy, but that spectrum has been codified much more. So when you start to make your choices about how to write it, it's in the perspective of what the player is going to appreciate. So writing prose is its own thing again, but this is the setup for making branching dialogues. So in conclusion, I screwed this up one more time. You are choice architects. When you're building this stuff, there's nothing neutral about the choices you're making. You have to plan it. RPG players want good choices, and that's very subjective. But the idea is if you're supporting a type of character in a character range, they want to feel like that's valid for them. And the games that do this really well really make players they just love those games because they'll come up with I see the craziest character concepts people come up with for New Vegas, and a lot of it is in their head. A lot of it is sort of self-narration about the sort of person they are and where they came from. Some of the craziest stuff. But if the choices support it, then they feel really excited about it, and they really attach to it. Designer and player goals can be in conflict. Your narrative goals, their desires as a player. You have to resolve those conflicts or at least accept the consequences of that conflict. You can't resolve every single thing, but you have to at least recognize it, plan for it, and accept it. Thank you very much. I believe, hey, we have 3 microphones. It's awesome. Hello.
So thank you so much for that great informative talk. I had a lot of amazing techniques for branching dialogues. I'm wondering about your assertion about players wanting good choices. And I totally believe you about most players, but it makes me think of players who look for hard choices because they're not validated, right? Like players who want to play a pacifist front of a certain type of game because it's so hard and because it's unrewarding. And I'm wondering, would you ever make a game where there's a set of choices that have no reward, maybe until the very end, and if you just went without reward, you get like a single flower or something like that, you know?
I think that's valid because what you're talking about is sort of, there is a reward there, but you have to identify what that reward is. So people that play pacifist runs, because you can play Fallout New Vegas as a pacifist run, and I don't think you have to actually kill anybody. And people enjoy that, and the reward is the fact that they didn't have to do that at all. The thing is, though, inherently, they know what's coming for them. Like, they know that that's out there. For example, if we said, hey, you can do a pacifist run of this, and they got halfway through and were like, psych, you got to kill this guy, they would be livid and pissed because we betrayed their expectations. We did not forecast what was going to happen. There is actually an interesting thing where, for example, in Honest Hearts, there's a part where you're trying to evacuate, and you can play as a pacifist. If you go in there and you say, like, I don't want to fight any of the white legs, these tribals that are just butchering everyone. And what Daniel says is, if you don't kill these guys, they're going to kill a ton of the Sorrows, this very innocent group of people. And you can say, like, well, too bad, I'm not going to fight. And you can do it. But the consequence of that is forecast ahead of time to them. And I think that as long as you sort of communicate to them, this is going to be the reward, this is, it's sort of self-forecasting in the case of pacifism, because that is, ahead of time they know, I can do this, the whole game supports it, I can get through it, I don't have to do it, that's fine.
So you don't have to give them like a system reward, like you get a special bonus if you were a pacifist?
I don't think you have to. I mean, I think if you want to, that's fine. Again, if you want to forecast that. For a while we had challenges in New Vegas. They were too hard to track, but for what, I can't remember the technical reason, but we had pacifist like sort of rewards for people that got to level 10 or level 20 without killing anyone. So you can build that in. I think the important thing is, one way or another, you have to figure out what the player is actually going to enjoy, because a lot of it is very subjective. Some people just like being a good person and like people responding to them very warmly in the world. And so that can be a very good reward for them.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great talk and fantastic game as well. I think I was just wondering, where you were presenting there with the example where you had the speech statistic and the notion that you can win a conversation. And actually, I found that was really effective in Fallout New Vegas, because I could grow my character in that way. Because combat obviously is a gameplay system, and you resolve it by winning. And felt you could have that ability to express yourself by growing in combat, or express yourself by growing in conversation. So if you remove the ability to win in a conversation, or to have a sense of having varying degrees of success within that system, how can you still enable players to feel like they're growing in that part of their character or that role?
I think it's a difficult question, because when we say that the player wins in there, there's not actually a game there. Like, the game, if anything, the game is the strategic game to put your points in your speech skill, but there's no real way to forecast that stuff. So if a player's already put the points in it, when they get to that point, there is no gameplay there. It's just combat. You put your points into your skill, but then you still have to move around and actually choose when to shoot and when to take cover, when to use your stims. So it is a very difficult problem, and we've seen games that have tried to tackle this. Oblivion tried to make it more gamey, and I don't think a lot of people responded super positively to that. It's a difficult question. I don't know what the exact right answer is. I do feel that it doesn't have to be a skill that you put points into. I think that dialogue can be a thing that you feel like you navigate your way through, and you build reputations. I think there's a lot more that we can do with indirect reactivity mechanics that make people feel like they're playing through that. The important thing to me is that people stop and think, and they make their choices, and they're weighing the tactical and strategic things. Speech skill is not, in conversation, is not a tactical choice nor a strategic choice. And that's what it comes down to for me. And I'm sorry, I don't know where to go with that. But I know that a lot of people commented on it and felt that it was kind of out of place.
Mm-hmm. Cool, thank you.
Is there one more? 3, 2? Great. Shrugging.
Can you talk a bit about the granularity of choices and where you figure out where to fall on that spectrum? I think at the bottom of the spectrum of a game like Bioshock 2, where you had like 4 choices over the course of the game, they were all incredibly memorable to me. They felt they were very difficult choices to make, and I remember every single one of them. At the far end of the scale, of course, something like Fallout New Vegas, where there are constant choices, and each one feels, in a way, a little less important, because, that's a design choice in a way. But then there's something in the middle, like Alpha Protocol, where fewer choices, but they're more meaningful. What do you do with that scale, and how do you sort of decide where to end up?
I think a lot of it has to do with, again, the range that you want to support, the range of reactivity you want to support, and the range of expression that you want to support. So I think early on in BioShock, I don't think the player's under any illusions that they're going to be making a ton of choices. And so there's limited numbers of choices, limited amount of reactivity. In Alpha Protocol, I think actually, in many ways, Alpha Protocol is kind of the way to go as far as conversation mechanics go, because Alpha Protocol is every conversation feels like a scene. It has a beginning and an end, and it like flows, and people are talking about things, and it doesn't sort of branch out into a big info dump or anything like that. And you feel like you're making meaningful choices in there. But I think ultimately it has to do with figuring out how much expression do you want to actually support in the game. What do you think players are going to want to do? If you think players are going to come up against these situations where they say, I really wish that I could do something different in this situation, then that's something you consider like, well, maybe we should have a choice here to determine how the player can go through it. But I think it's a stylistic thing on a game-by-game basis. So I guess one more question at least.
Hi. You made a point like about info dumping in dialogue, and also your reference to one of the characters making reference to something that actually wasn't in the game. And I found my experience, especially with Skyrim, this didn't happen so much with Fallout, because I think maybe the writing was better, but in Skyrim I felt the shallowness of kind of this big fleshed out world at points, because there were characters that I wanted to interact with or know more about that didn't even have that kind of option to sort of engage further with them in a sense, or that just that simple option like, who are you type of deal. And I was wondering, like, do you think there are better techniques within dialogue to sort of provide that kind of closure or bridge?
Yes, I do. So I think that the answers to things don't always lie in films, but I think that we can take a lot of... There's never a point, well, I shouldn't say never. It's very rare there's a point in a film where someone says, hey, I'm this guy. Like, every character comes in and I explain who I am and blah, blah, blah. It's done in the context of the plot. And so you learn about the character through the context of the struggle. And that's one of the reasons, again, why I think that Alpha Protocol did a really great job, because every scene was about a thing. Like, two people or more in conflict, they want something, they're working towards it. And in the course of that revelation, you learn about the character of that person. Here's another thing. Interesting conflict reveals tons about characters. The sort of Jesus Hitler characters, nobody finds those characters enjoyable. But when you, like a character like Sophie in Sophie's Choice, that wrecked her whole character. Or even if you look at, I was talking to my friend Terry yesterday about James Bond, about Casino Royale. So in Casino Royale, you kind of see young Daniel Craig. You see young James Bond as the sort of reckless dude who gets shaped through these difficult things that he has to deal with, these difficult choices that he has to make. And he seems, I think, a lot more interesting as a character because of those choices. So when we instead of a character saying, hey, here's a quest, if they become more emotionally engaged and involved in that, and you become engaged with them, I think that reveals a lot more interesting stuff about characters. One more? Cool, last. Nobody. Hooray, we won, everybody, we won. Thank you. So again, thank you all for coming, and don't forget to fill out the evaluation. Thanks.